Sometimes, the most powerful stories don't begin with wealth or fame or even hope. They begin with a trembling voice at the door and a mother too hungry to hide her pride. If this story stirs your heart, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that remind us humanity still exists. It was one of those cold, gray mornings where everything felt silent, too silent. Even in the middle of a busy city, the tall iron gates of Mr. Dorian Chase's estate hadn't been open for weeks. Inside, the millionaire tech mogul hadn't spoken to anyone since his wife's funeral. He'd shut the world out, letting the silence grow thick around him. Then came a knock. Not the kind of knock meant for the rich. Not a delivery, not a business deal, but something softer, hesitant, almost embarrassed. Dorian glanced up from the leather chair, where he'd sat unmoved for hours. The butler was off duty. So, for the first time in months, he rose and answered the door himself. There she stood, a woman in her mid-30s, clothes clinging to her frame from rain, her hair undone, cheeks hollow from hunger, but her eyes, those warm, tired eyes, held a quiet strength. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not here to beg. I'm a single mom. I can clean your house, your floors, your windows, anything. Just, if I could get a plate of food for me and my son." Dorian didn't speak, not because he didn't know what to say, but because her voice, her exact words, echoed something his late wife had once said the first time they met. That memory hit him like a wave, knocking the air from his lungs. He looked at her again, really looked this time. The worn shoes, the trembling hands, the soaked coat hiding a smaller jacket beneath. She wasn't just asking for charity. She was fighting to stay dignified, even while starving. For the first time in months, his voice returned. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Grace," she said. "Grace Holloway. And your son, Micah, he's just 4. Dorian stepped aside. "Come in," as she stepped into the grand hallway, dripping wet, yet walking tall. She didn't realize her life was about to change forever, but neither did Dorian, because Grace wasn't just any woman in need. She was about to be the one who would clean more than his house. She would wipe the dust from his soul. Sometimes connection grows not in the loud moments, but in shared silences, gentle glances, and the quiet rituals of survival. Grace didn't ask for anything more than food, but Dorian started noticing. She brought life back into a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Grace never asked questions. She came early, sometimes before sunrise, and stayed late if she had to. She swept floors, dusted bookshelves that hadn't been touched in years, folded linens with military precision, all while her son Micah sat quietly near the kitchen, coloring with whatever scraps of paper he could find. Dorian watched, often from behind his office door. At first, it was suspicion, a habit formed from years of being surrounded by opportunists and gold diggers. But Grace never stepped foot in rooms she hadn't been told to clean. She never lingered where she wasn't needed, and she never once looked him in the eye like she wanted anything from him. Except that first day, he started finding small changes. The kitchen smelled like fresh herbs. A cracked painting had been reframed. Someone had fixed a loose piano key in the west hallway. She hadn't done any of it for praise. She just did it. One rainy afternoon, Dorian passed by the kitchen and heard Micah humming softly. Grace had given the boy a pan and a spoon, and he was tapping a gentle rhythm like it was a drum. Dorian paused at the doorframe, just listening. Then Micah looked up and said, "Mommy says this house used to be sad." Dorian's breath caught. "What does she say now?" he asked, stepping inside. Micah grinned with missing teeth. "She says it's trying to remember how to smile." That night, Dorian invited them both to dinner. It wasn't a grand event, just pasta, some bread, and leftover soup, but to Grace, it was more than a meal. It was trust. It was acknowledgement. And it was the first time she'd eaten at a table with another adult in years. They talked, not about deep things, just about rain and bad traffic, and how Michael loved drawing trees with red leaves, even in summer. But it was something, and something was better than the nothing Dorian had felt for too long. After Grace left that evening, Dorian stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the chair she had sat in. For the first time in what felt like forever, he noticed how quiet the house wasn't. There was laughter now, echoes of it still hanging in the air. There was warmth in the empty spaces. And though he didn't want to admit it yet, he felt it creeping in, that dangerous, beautiful thing. Every heart holds a secret, some wrapped in shame, others sealed in pain. But when two broken people begin to heal together, those hidden truths don't stay buried forever. And sometimes they change everything. It began with a photo. Grace had been cleaning the study, the only room Dorian hadn't yet given her permission to enter. But that day, he left the door cracked open and said quietly, "If you're careful, you can tidy up in there." She had nodded and stepped inside. The room was dim, full of shadows and dust. Books lined every wall, and a half-burned candle sat on the corner of a desk, unmoved for what felt like years. Grace moved carefully, wiping the shelves and dusting picture frames. Most were Dorian at black-tie events, shaking hands with CEOs or giving speeches to packed halls. But one photo, tucked behind a cracked globe on the shelf, made her pause. It was of a woman, laughing carefree, holding a tiny dog in one arm and gripping Dorian's hand with the other. The way he looked at her in the photo was not just love, it was devotion. Grace picked it up gently. Her name was Lillian. Came Dorian's voice from the doorway. Grace turned, startled. She loved collecting stray animals, he continued, walking into the room. That one in her arms? She rescued it from a frozen alley, carried it in her coat, and made me build a bed for it out of cashmere scarves. Grace smiled softly. I lost her to cancer 2 years ago. She didn't even make it to 30. Silence stretched between them, fragile and aching. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. He nodded. "So am I?" Grace hesitated, then said, "Micah, he never knew his father." Dorian looked up. "I was 18 when I got pregnant. His father left before he was born. My parents kicked me out. I've been working ever since, waitressing, cleaning, whatever I could do. Some nights I didn't eat, so he could." She wasn't trying to win sympathy. She said it like it was just life. Truth laid bare. Dorian sat down slowly, his fingers running over the spine of a book on the desk. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." Grace didn't reply, but something in her chest loosened, a wall, long held up, beginning to fall. Later that night, after she left, Dorian opened the drawer of his desk and took out a small velvet box. Inside was a necklace, a silver chain with a moon-shaped pendant. Lillian had planned to give it to their daughter, if they'd ever had one. He held it tightly and whispered, "What are you doing to me, Grace?" Because for the first time in 2 years, the ghost of his past didn't hurt as much. And for the first time in forever, the future didn't feel so empty. Every heart that begins to heal also fears one thing, being broken all over again. And just when Grace started to trust the warmth she found in Dorian's home, the past came knocking with claws sharp enough to tear everything apart. It started with a knock on the gate, just like the day Grace first arrived. But this time it wasn't her. Dorian was in the garden with Micah, helping the boy build a birdhouse from scraps of cedar wood. Grace had gone into town to apply for a part-time evening shift at the community center, try to prove she wasn't depending on Dorian's kindness. The security guard called from the front. "Sir, there's a man here. Says he's Micah's father." Dorian's entire body stiffened. He walked to the front, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. There, leaning casually against a shiny black pickup truck, was a man in worn jeans, tattoos creeping up his neck, and a smirk that didn't match the words coming from his mouth. "Name's Troy. I'm here for my son." Dorian narrowed his eyes. "Micah doesn't even know you exist." "Doesn't matter. I saw a video of Grace online last week. Some church charity post. Took me 2 seconds to figure out she was here. Figure it was time I came back for what's mine. He's not a possession." Troy chuckled. "Maybe not, but I've got rights." Dorian's jaw clenched. He could already feel the storm coming. Grace didn't talk about this man, but Dorian had suspected there was more to her story. Now it was unfolding right at his doorstep. When Grace returned that evening and saw Troy standing outside, her entire body froze. "No," she breathed. "Not now. Not here." "Relax," Troy said, spreading his arms. I'm just visiting. You left me pregnant on a bus stop bench. You think you get to just show up now and play dad. I changed. No, you ran. Dorian watched the pain in her eyes. Not just fear, but shame. And the worst part was she thought Dorian would see her differently now. She turned to him slowly, voice trembling. I'm sorry. I didn't think he'd ever come back. But Dorian didn't flinch. He looked at Troy, then at Grace, then said simply, Mike is in the guest room, playing with paints. He doesn't need to know anything until you decide. That stunned her more than any outburst could have. But the damage had been done. The next day, Grace didn't show up, nor the next. No call, no message. Dorian sat in his office, staring at the untouched coffee she used to bring him every morning. He wondered if she believed he'd judged her. He wondered if her walls had gone back up. He didn't know where she was. All he knew was that her absence made the house feel like a tomb again. And in that silence, he realized something terrifying. He needed her far more than he was ready to admit. Sometimes it's not betrayal or loss that hurts the most. It's the silence after someone you started to trust disappears without goodbye. And in that stillness, even the strongest hearts begin to question everything, including whether they were ever enough. 3 days. That's how long it had been since Grace walked out his life without a word. Dorian stared at the dining table, where 2 chairs now sat permanently empty. He still laid out 3 plates each morning, then put them away untouched. Micah's paints, one scattered joyfully across the guest room floor, had been packed back into a shoebox. The boy was gone, and with him, so was the color in Dorian's world. He hadn't realized how quickly their presence had filled the void. And now, without warning, it was back. That empty space. That echo in every hallway. That cold silence in the kitchen where laughter used to bounce. Dorian checked his phone again. No messages. No missed calls. He had considered calling the shelters, the church group, even driving to every corner of the city, but something stopped him. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the doubt whispering in his mind. She didn't trust you enough to say goodbye. Had he failed her somehow? Did his silence when Troy appeared make her believe she wasn't safe here? He replayed the moment over and over in his mind. The way she looked at him after Troy showed up. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but something else too. Shame. Not because of who Troy was, but because she thought Dorian now saw her differently. And he hated that. He hated that she had spent her whole life surviving, protecting her child, only to feel like she had to run again. He walked through the study, where the photo of Lillian still sat. But today, he looked at it differently. I loved you, he whispered. But I think I'm falling in love again. It felt disloyal to say out loud, but it was also true. He had fallen for Grace's quiet strength, for her fierce love for Micah, for the way she made his house feel alive again. But none of it mattered now, because she was gone. Dorian walked into the guest room one last time and sat on the bed where Micah had once curled up for naps. He spotted a small red crayon wedge beneath the pillow. He picked it up and turned it in his fingers. On the wall beside the bed was a piece of paper taped up like a tiny mural. It was a drawing, 3 stick figures, a man, a woman, and a small boy holding their hands. Above the figures, written in messy red crayon, were the words, Home. Dorian's throat tightened, because now, more than ever, he realized he didn't just want them to come back. He needed them to. Hope doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it slips in quietly, through a child's drawing, as set in the air, or the familiar creak of a door. Just when Dorian believed she was gone for good, Grace left behind a whisper that said, Not yet. It was early evening when the wind picked up, sharp, restless, and strangely cold for spring. Dorian was in the garden, staring at the half-finished birdhouse Micah had built. He hadn't touched it since they left. He couldn't, but tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the way the wind carried the smell of cinnamon, Grace's favorite tea, or how the sunset painted the sky in soft, pink-golden hues, just like the scarf she used to wear. Whatever it was, it stirred something in him, a flicker of warmth in the middle of the numb. Then the doorbell rang. Dorian didn't move at first. His heart began to beat faster, but his legs felt frozen. He told himself it was probably a delivery, maybe a neighbor. But deep down, something whispered, "Go." Now, he opened the front door slowly, and there she was, soaked from the light drizzle, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes puffy like she hadn't slept in days. Behind her, Micah held a paper bag, gripping it like a precious treasure. Dorian didn't speak, afraid that if he did, the moment would disappear. Grace looked up at him, eyes glistening. "I wasn't going to come back. I thought I had ruined everything. But Micah," he kept drawing her face. She gave a shaky laugh. "He asked if we could come home, and when I said we didn't live here, he said, 'But I feel you smile more here.'" She took a breath. "I didn't come to ask for anything. I just want to say thank you, and to return this." She reached into her bag and pulled out the moon-shaped silver pendant, the one Dorian had shown her once but never gave. "How did you?" he asked. "You left it in the guest room drawer. I think you meant to give it to someone one day." He stared at it, then at her. "I did." Micah stepped forward and tugged at Dorian's sleeve. "I missed your pancakes," he whispered. Dorian knelt down and smiled. "They missed you too, little man." For a long moment, none of them said anything. Then Dorian looked up at Grace. "You don't have to explain. I just want you to know, the house was never full until you both walked in." Tears spilled from Grace's eyes, but this time they weren't heavy. They were relief. Release. She nodded slowly. "We're tired. We've been running for so long." "Then stop running," he said gently. "Stay." She didn't answer with words. She simply stepped inside. And just like that, hope didn't knock this time. It walked back in. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it's a quiet promise whispered in the kitchen, sealed not by a ring, but by trust earned the hard way. And when Grace finally stopped running, Dorian finally found the courage to say what his heart had been holding back. That night, the house felt different. Not just fuller, but alive. Grace had changed into dry clothes. Micah was curled up on the couch, fast asleep with a blanket wrapped around him and a bowl of half-eaten popcorn still in his lap. The storm outside had faded into a gentle drizzle, tapping against the windows like a lullaby. In the kitchen, Dorian poured 2 cups of tea. The cinnamon scent drifted softly through the air, warm, familiar, safe. Grace leaned against the counter, her hands wrapped around the mug he handed her. For a moment, they didn't speak. They just stood there, close enough to feel each other's breath, each lost in their own thoughts. "You didn't have to take us back," she said quietly. "You didn't have to come back," he replied. She smiled, a small, tired smile that carried months of weight. "I don't know how to stop bracing for the worst," she admitted. "Everywhere I go, I feel like I'm just waiting for someone to change their mind, to walk away." Dorian's voice was gentle. "I used to feel that way too. When Lillian died, I thought no one could ever be more than temporary. But you," he looked at her, really looked, "you're not just someone passing through." She held his gaze, afraid to believe him, but needing to. He stepped closer, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the moon-shaped pendant again. "I didn't forget this. I didn't lose it. I left it where I hoped it would be found." He took her hand, placed the pendant in her palm, and closed her fingers around it. "This was meant for someone I'd never met yet," he said. "Someone who didn't ask for love, but earned it without trying. Someone who made this house a home again." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what the future holds," he continued, his voice trembling now. "But I know one thing. You'll never have to face it alone. Not again." Grace let out a shaky breath. "That sounds like a promise." "It is." And then, without fanfare, without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her. Not a kiss, not a confession, just a hold that said everything words couldn't. Grace leaned into him, and for the first time in years, let herself be held without flinching. Outside, the clouds parted. The storm had passed. And inside that kitchen, under soft light and the warmth of steeped cinnamon, 2 souls who thought they were too broken to be loved found peace in a promise. Sometimes joy doesn't come with a warning. It sneaks in through burned pancakes, paint-splattered pajamas, or a child's giggle that shakes the walls. And for Grace and Dorian, happiness arrived not with diamonds or roses, but with laughter that felt like freedom. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows like golden ribbons. It was the first truly clear day in weeks. No gray clouds, no drizzle. Just sky. Dorian was already awake. He stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, confidently flipping pancakes, while humming a tune he hadn't realized he remembered. Micah sat on the counter beside him, legs swinging and cheeks covered in flour. Grace stepped in, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair wild from sleep. "You're cooking?" she asked, half smirking. Dorian grinned. "Trying to impress you." Micah chimed in, "We already burned the first two." Grace laughed, really laughed, and it startled her. The sound filled the room like music. She walked over, took the spatula gently from Dorian's hand, and whispered, "Okay, chef, let's not burn the third." They made a mess. Pancake batter ended up on the floor. Micah spilled orange juice and stepped in it. Grace accidentally flipped a pancake onto the stove instead of the pan, and Dorian broke an egg so hard it cracked on the counter and the floor. But none of it mattered, because the kitchen was filled with something rare and precious. Laughter. Micah laughed so hard he got the hiccups. Grace laughed until she cried. And Dorian, the man who had spent years mourning in silence, laughed until he couldn't breathe. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. After breakfast, they went outside. Grace sat on the porch with her tea, while Dorian and Micah painted the half-finished birdhouse. At first, Dorian tried to direct the colors. A clean coat with brown, maybe blue trim. But Micah had other plans. He dipped his brush in green, then yellow, then red, making wild streaks across the tiny roof. Dorian raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this design?" Micah grinned. "It's rainbow camouflage, for happy birds." Dorian laughed. "Well, how can I argue with that?" Grace snapped a photo. The two of them crouched in the sun, surrounded by spilled paint, deep in serious artistic conversation. She looked at the photo, then at them. This wasn't survival. This was living. Later that afternoon, Grace found a small wrapped box on her pillow. Inside was a second moon pendant, smaller, carved from wood. Micah had painted it himself. In messy, slanted letters on the back, it read, "For Mommy, from home." Grace held it to her heart, eyes stinging with tears. She looked out the window, where Dorian was pushing Micah on a swing he just built from an old tire. And in that quiet moment, she whispered to herself, "We're going to be okay." Because sometimes the most unexpected joy comes from the life you never knew you were building, until it's already yours. Real love isn't proven during peaceful mornings or painted birdhouses. It's tested in moments of uncertainty. When old fears return, new storms rise, and the question isn't do we love each other, but can we survive what's coming next? Summer drifted in gently. The house was no longer quiet. It was filled with music, meals, and the daily rituals of a little boy who had finally found safety. Grace and Dorian were building a rhythm. Not a perfect one, but a real one. Micah started preschool at the local community center, proudly carrying his backpack each morning and returning home with stories about frogs and glue and a girl named Harper who liked his drawings. Dorian spent more time away from work and more time with them. Grace started her part-time job at the same center, running an art therapy group for single mothers. She didn't tell them her full story, just enough to let them know she understood what it meant to feel forgotten. But life, as always, had its own plans. It began with a letter. Dorian found it buried in a stack of business mail he had ignored for weeks. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with gold foil. Inside, an invitation to a high-profile gala in Manhattan, a tech event, his past life calling him back. He had been chosen to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, something he had once dreamed of, but now it felt foreign. Still, he showed the invitation to Grace that night. "You should go," she said, trying to smile. "I don't need their applause," he replied, watching her carefully. "But maybe you need to know that you didn't disappear, that the man you were still exists." He looked down. "I like the man I'm becoming more." But what neither of them said, not out loud, was that the world they were building now might not survive under the bright lights of the one he left behind. The days that followed were tense. Old habits crept in. Dorian became distracted, answering emails late at night, taking calls during breakfast. He didn't notice Micah's drawing stacking up on his desk, or the way Grace had started sleeping curled up on one side of the bed, no longer reaching for him in the dark. And then, 2 nights before the gala, she said it, "You're slipping away?" He looked up from his laptop, stunned. "What?" "You're retreating," she said softly. "You said you didn't want that world anymore, but now that it wants you back, you're disappearing again." He stood, angry now. "This isn't fair, Grace. It's just one night." "It's not about the night," she said, holding back tears. "It's about what comes after." She wasn't jealous. She wasn't even scared of the gala. She was scared of being left behind again, of becoming another temporary chapter in a very important man's life. That night, Dorian sat alone in his study, the invitation open in front of him and one question burning through his heart. Who was he without them? Sometimes love doesn't need grand gestures, just a quiet choice to stay, to show up, again and again, even when it's hard. The night of the gala arrived, but Dorian wasn't in Manhattan. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor of Micah's room, helping him build a cardboard rocket ship out of cereal boxes and colored tape. Grace stood quietly in the hallway, watching. He had made his choice. The invitation lay torn in the trash. The tuxedo stayed in its garment bag. The world could applaud someone else tonight. Dorian West had nothing left to prove. Not to the tech industry, not to the press, not to his old life. Just to her and her little boy. Later that night, when Micah was asleep, curled up in a cocoon of blankets, Grace walked into the kitchen where Dorian was washing a single plate. He turned to face her, not sure what to expect. But she didn't say anything. She just walked over, wrapped her arms around him from behind, and rested her cheek against his back. It was the first time she'd touched him in days. "I was scared," she whispered. "So was I," he said softly. "But not of losing that life. Of losing you." Grace pulled back just enough to look up at him. "I don't want you to shrink yourself for us, Dorian." "I'm not," he replied. "I'm finally growing into someone I respect." He reached into his back pocket and handed her a folded paper. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I started this morning." She opened it. It was a blueprint, not for a business, not for an app, for a center, a space in the city, a resource hub for single mothers, with childcare, free classes, legal support, a garden in the middle, a studio, a place to start again. He titled it The Grace Center. Her eyes filled with tears. "You're serious?" He nodded. "You gave me purpose. Let me help give it to others." The next year was full of change. The Grace Center broke ground that fall. Grace became its heart, mentoring women, leading art programs, and hiring staff who knew what it meant to survive. Dorian found peace, not in silence or seclusion, but in service. Micah? He flourished. At his school's winter recital, when asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he said loudly, "I want to be like him." And he pointed to Dorian in the crowd. The whole room turned to see the once reclusive millionaire with tears in his eyes, standing and clapping. Life didn't get easier, but it became full of color, of sound, of love. Not the love that fades or flickers, the kind that stays, that chooses you, even when the world calls you away. And on a quiet Sunday morning, while painting a birdhouse together on the porch, Grace looked up at Dorian and whispered, "Thank you for staying." He kissed her forehead gently and said, "I never left. I just finally arrived.